I first heard of the hidden portrait of Sir Isaac Whitmore during my earlier years. At the time, I was living at our ancestral family home of Dust Wall Manor, located in the tender Welsh countryside. It was my grandfather, my only living relative, who related the story to me. Not much is known about our family's famed progenitor, but supposedly, deep within Dust Wall Manor, a room exists, the study of Sir Isaac Whitmore, and in it hangs the sole existing portrait of the man. I never learned of the authenticity of this story, this rumor, for I was never able to roam the seamlessly endless halls of Dust Wall Manor unsupervised. Too big was the chance for a young child to get lost in its winding labyrinthian hallways. My grandfather was a studious man, a scholar, but also a hermit, who chose to spend his remaining years at Dust Wall Manor. After my mother's death and childbirth, he'd taken my upbringing and early education upon himself. He instructed me on such subjects as history, mythology, and philosophy, but also hinted at other more secretive studies he partook in. Yet, he'd also share many a tale relating to our family and, of course, the story of Sir Isaac's portrait. Once I was of suitable age, he sent me off to the grand city of London, where I first attended a prestigious boarding school and, eventually, the King's College, London, all paid for by our family's lavish fortune. My first field of choice was that of history, an interest brought forth by my grandfather's many tales. After only a few semesters, however, I moved on to the study of contemporary politics, driven by an ever-growing, almost unconscious need to understand the workings of our modern world. While I analyzed the workings of the world at large, I grew more and more interested in a smaller picture of my very own family line. As a pastime, a hobby, really, I set out to complete a family tree of the Whitmore line, something no one had ever attempted, at least if I were to trust my grandfather's words. This endeavor of mine, however, seemed to be doomed from its outset, and even after I'd consulted the vast archives in London, I was only able to put together a rough patchwork of unrelated names and lost relatives. As I'd learned from my grandfather, the Whitmore family was a secluded one, always had been, and many of his members had preferred to hide away from the world and spend their entire existence deep within the secure walls of Dust Wall Manor. Even those who'd venture forth into the world driven by their own ambitions or in search of adventure would ultimately, and without fail, return to the manor. It should be the same for me. Upon graduation, I took up a position as a teaching assistant, but my heart never belonged to the grand capital. Instead, I longed to return to the ancient walls of Dust Wall Manor. With each passing year, I felt less at home in London. It was loud, dirty, and a crowded city, one teeming with people, a city that never slept, an ever-changing beast of the mundane, social merriment, and overindulgence. The longer I suffered through its wakefulness, its wastefulness, the more I longed for the stillness and comfortable melancholia I'd so felt from the steadfast walls of my home. I felt, frankly, different from other people, like a different breed. And so, in the third decade of my life, I decided to leave the grand capital behind and return home. I'd not visit the manor since my grandfather had sent me off to a boarding school, not even upon his death, honoring his last wish to focus on my studies and not a secluded old man. Yet I remembered the way without fail. Knew exactly which of the small winding country roads to take, treating the car's navigation system as nothing more than a voice of whispered reinforcements. Eventually, I could make out the towering Gothic spires that form the heart of Dust Wall Manor on the distant horizon. When I laid eyes upon them, the strangest of feelings washed over me. A feeling that was more than simple nostalgia, for it felt almost like a presence was calling out to me, as if the manor itself was alive and had, for all those years, waited for me to return. Dust Wall Manor was a place of architectural madness, and I only now realized how truly monstrous its dimensions were. It was a gigantic construction that had been ever extended, comprising dozens of buildings, wings, and endless rooms all interconnected, an amalgamation of centuries' worth of mortar and brick. Its heart was a magnificent example of Gothic architecture, giving the entire building a feeling of excessive antiquity, and making entry into the grand vestibule feel like you'd set foot in an ancient cathedral. Its wings, which had been added over the course of centuries, were a tour de force of Europe's architectural greatness. The Gothic gave way to the pillars, domes, and columns of the Renaissance, reminiscent of classic antiquity, before those were overtaken by the grander, more excessive style of the Baroque, which was replaced in turn by the purity and authenticity of the neoclassical. Only the newest additions to the manor were held in the more modern and contemporary styles of the current day. While many of the manor's distant and forgotten wings were covered in fungi and long vines, none of the manor's walls showed signs of damage. None of the many distant and half-forgotten wings had collapsed. And there were no sign of dilapidation, decay amongst the entirety of the manor. How this was possible was yet another mystery amongst a sheer endless number surrounding it, as well as my family. As I stared at these bleak, century-old walls, at the giant, watchful eye-like windows, at its almost unnerving patchwork architecture, I was flooded with a feeling of deep nostalgia. It's so long for this place, and now I knew I was finally and forever home. When I set foot in the building's grand vestibule, I felt small, almost like I was a child again, pushed back to my early years when the proportions of the manor had seemed unreal and scary. Many long hallways reminiscent of gaping maws ready to swallow me up. Even now, it felt as if the manor's interior dimensions, as ridiculous as it sounds, dwarfed even its gigantic interior. From the grand vestibule, a wide hallway stretched on and led deeper into the manor, connecting it to its Gothic heart, but also the various wings and other hallways snaking their way through the building. As I followed this hallway, my eyes wandered over its excessive design and the many lavish decorations. I remembered now that this hallway was not merely an entryway, but so much more. My footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor. My hands glided gently over the many tapestries adorning the mighty walls. They depicted iconic scenes from the Bible, showcased creatures from mythology, and even famous historical events. Their composition and make is different as the manor's architecture. Some were centuries old, their fibers stiff and hardened, their colors phased, while others were in almost pristine condition. They all painted a histogram of colors, threads, stitches of various kinds. The upper part of the walls were adorned with costly hardwood paneling, coated with gold leaf and other similarly costly materials. And finally, above it all, loomed the hallway's high, intricately carved ceiling, forming a net of the most complicated art full of hidden details, their meaning lost through the passage of time. Here and there I found alcoves presenting trophies and artifacts brought back by those members of the Whitmore family line who'd ventured out into the world. Venetian masks were propped up next to knightly armor. Statues and figures created by Italian sculptors were accompanied by delicate German woodcuttings. Yet there were many other, more exotic items to behold. African stone carvings, tribal masks, clay tablets, Mesopotamian vases, and Asian weaponry. It was a showcasing, a testament to the lives lived in Dust Wall Manor of people's occupation and ambitions. This all added to the building's general atmosphere. Dust Wall Manor was an old place, a musty and antique one, but most of all, a lonely one. For it seemed I was the only person who'd set foot into these ancient walls ever since my grandfather's passing. All these decorations, these trophies and artifacts, however, gave it a strange sort of vitality. I'd only set foot in this hallway a few select times, and always accompanied by my grandfather. Now for the first time I was able to truly experience it, to truly absorb it all, and was utterly overwhelmed. After what felt like hours, and after I'd satisfied my curiosity, my nostalgia drove me back to my grandfather's former living quarters in the manor's most eastward wings. It was one of the newest additions to the building, commissioned by no other than my grandfather himself at his return to the manor. My grandfather's lodgings were sparsely furnished, and an expression of his hermit lifestyle. No tapestries hung against the walls, no carpets covered the cold marble floor. Instead, there was a stark functionality to it all. Every item had its function and was meticulously placed. It didn't matter if it was his reading chair next to the fireplace, the workbenches, which hinted at the hidden act of alchemy, a special interest of his, or the books in his small but dedicated library. While I could have chosen any other part of the manor, rooms much more lavishly furnished, it was here I felt most at home. It wasn't merely feelings of nostalgia, though, for I, too, had grown weary of the outside world, and of interacting with people, and over the years had taken on similar characteristics to those that had so marked my grandfather. After I'd settled in, I decided to continue my work on the Whitmore family tree. During my years in London, when this newest interest was first born, I'd never found much time to truly indulge in it. But out here in Dust Wall Manor, it felt I'd all the time in the world. I planned to record not merely who made up our family line, but also add my ancestors' various travels, works, and achievements, and all the fields in which the Whitmore name had left its mark, however minuscule they may be. I spent days sifting through my grandfather's personal library. While I found many an old tome to marvel at, there were scarcely a mention of the Whitmore name in any of them. Only a handful of books written by members of the family were cramped between other more important works, almost as if placed as an afterthought. One was written by an Isabella Whitmore and comprised roughly 24 melancholistic poems, authored by the woman herself. Another had the title De Feto Animalium, but was nothing but a long-winded thesis on the breeding of domesticated animals. The rest were similarly uninteresting and ultimately meaningless in the grander scope of my project. Before long, I ventured forth into the depths of Dustmore Manor, for my grandfather had spoken to me of other quarters similar to his, which had been left undisturbed for years. Whenever he'd talk of them, he was with a certain reservedness of character. The manor was too big, had become a beast too sprawling to ever take stock of, and there seemed to be an unspoken rule to leave those lodgings as they were, to serve as memorials of their former inhabitants' existences in this earth. Many of them, however, had gathered knowledge and books of their own, and my grandfather had often partaken on those small enclaves of knowledge, and on special occasions even stolen away with a book or two. Whenever I set out on those long, solitary walks through the manor's seemingly endlessly winding guts, I was filled with an unredeemed dreariness of thought. All of these hallways, all these rooms, they were covered in dust, cobwebs, filled with nothing but memories of people long gone, people who'd once lived here and were now entirely forgotten. All this filled me with what I can only refer to as a melancholistic loneliness. For these old, gigantic walls that made up Dustmore Manor were filled with an oppressive stillness, an almost constricting emptiness, an emptiness that you could almost feel. I couldn't help but wonder if my grandfather and those before him had felt the same thing as they wandered the manor. From the books I found and consulted during these walks, I slowly learned more about Sir Isaac Whitmore. The man was born in the middle of the 15th century, supposedly in the county of Herefordshire. He was a man of many talents, and even more ventures, an explorer, treasure hunter, and scholar. He amassed a massive fortune over his life and eventually constructed the heart of what should one day become known as Dust Wall Manor. The stories of the man's life were many, and as colorful and different as the number of books that I consulted. Some were diaries written by distant ancestors of mine, others were books entirely unrelated to the man's life. It mentioned his influence, deeds, and footnotes, written on yellowed pages and scribbled between the lines. It was said that in his younger years, Sir Isaac Whitmore became involved in the War of the Roses and was a secret confidant of the House of York. During the final years of the conflict, however, he set out on long travels, following in the footsteps of such legendary figures as Marco Polo. Ibn Battuta, partaking in vast journeys along the Silk Road, joining explorers in the heart of Africa, and supposedly even accompanying Christopher Columbus on his final voyage to the New World. It was these travels that eventually allowed him to take control of certain sectors of British trade and come to vast riches. How many of these stories are true and how many are nothing but fables and exaggerations, I wasn't able to ascertain, but they were enough to paint a rough picture of the man and our family's lines of origin. In all these books, however, I never found a description, much less a portrait of the man. The only thing mentioned was the same rumor my grandfather had shared with me, that somewhere, deep within Dust Wall Manor, lay Sir Isaac Whitmore's old study, and in it, the sole existing portrait of his likeness. In the weeks to come, I made substantial progress in my endeavor and steadily filled out the Whitmore family tree. What was originally nothing but a patchwork of a few select names finally took shape. As the work neared completion, however, I felt more and more drawn to the secrets of the manor itself. I began to take exhaustive walks through its endless hallways. It had been nothing but mild curiosity and had served the purpose of learning more about the many members of my family, soon became a sort of meditative obsession. Many times, without knowing why, I found I'd left my notes and quarters behind, and half in thought had begun on yet another excursion through a certain distant wing. My head filled with thoughts about Sir Isaac's life and his mysterious study. Before long, these walks grew not only of frequency, but also in length. On certain days, I found myself spending almost all my walking hours wandering and deep in thought, and slowly, ever so slowly, my obsession grew, became a hot, almost burning desire. Wherever I went, however much I walked, I found no hint of the fabled study. Deep inside, I'd half hoped, half expected to eventually traverse the manor in its entirety and stumble upon it by accident, but the manor proved much larger than I'd imagined. With each walk, with each day, I found more hallways, more rooms, found myself in entirely new areas, apartments and wings, places hidden away which I'd never known existed. Eventually, out of desperation, I decided to consult the manor's floor plans. It became evident that I wasn't the first who had attempted to make sense of the labyrinthian monstrosity that was Dust Wall Manor. An almost innumerable amount of floor plans of varying degree and make existed. Some were delicate, the work of studied man, others shoddy and hand-drawn. Some resembled ever-growing patchworks as if they were the effort of multiple people continued throughout the generation. The works of fevered insanity. They differed widely, at times made no sense, at others included hidden rooms and secret wings that didn't exist. It was nothing but purest madness, and yet I was driven by the single purpose of making sense of it all. Even amongst those floor plans, however, I soon realized there was no hint of Sir Isaac's study, and I began to wonder if it truly existed. Yet my obsession never waned, the burning desire never left me, and if anything, seemed to grow ever stronger, and soon affected me not only during the day, but also the night, for I became haunted by dreams of the strangest sort. In them I was walking through a grand structure, a hall wider than any I'd encountered in the manor. Its ceiling was high and arched, its walls covered in innumerable doorways, giving them the appearance of a crazed honeycomb. Whenever I turned to look into these doorways, I bore witness to strange, ungodly things. Some led into dark, looming corridors, others into rooms which I saw performances of forbidden rituals, the work of sorcerers and magic, of alchemy and other disciplines of the occult. I even saw what I assumed to be chambers of torture, filled with flesh and blood, in which creatures not entirely human were born, these twisted creations roaming the most distant of the dark corridors, being forever twisted and ruined, perpetually broken. Only the echo of their miserable cries evidenced their existence. Nonetheless, it was a place of wonder, and its results, as ghastly and abominable as they were magnificent and awe-inspiring. The ends of the dreams were always the same, however. After traversing the grand hall for what felt like an eternity, I found myself in front of a grand arched entryway. This arch, I knew, led into a single room, a mad construction, an amalgamation of all things wrong on this earth, a room grander even than this hall, the study of no other than Sir Isaac Whitmore. Yet I was never able to set foot inside. For the moment I laid eyes upon the structure, I always awoke, shivering and covered in a cold sweat. These dreams unnerved me more than anything. I wondered why my mind conjured up these ghastly visions and how they came to haunt me every night without fail. Their effect on me was a noticeable one. I began to suffer from increased superstition of the old walls and what lay beyond them, of what lay in the unexplored depths of Dust Wall Manor, and each week, each day, the feeling seemed to increase and spread over my consciousness like a shroud of purest darkness. Even worse, with each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more detailed, and my knowledge of the abominable hall and its many adjacent rooms and dark corridors grew even deeper. In one dream, I heard prayers in a language older than any known to man, partook in a strange scrying, and even hours after waking up, I shuddered at the outlandish and otherworldly things revealed there. In another one, I bore witness to the creation of what I came to call flesh constructs. They were meticulously formed from the meat of different animals, combined and brought to life by arcane incantations, created from human beings, their bodies first torn apart, then fused together again in ways much too different from what they once were. I even caught glimpses of the secret arts of alchemy used to turn metal into gold, of the growing of mandragoras, and concoctions so weird their effects defied my understanding. Sometimes when I awoke from those dreams, I felt something that differed from the usual terror, for it was replaced by the strangest feeling of familiarity, as if I'd walked those halls before, during my waking hours. I'd long considered those dreams nothing but twisted interpretations of my long walks through Dust Wall Manor, warped and skewed by my innermost fears and worries, a byproduct of my ever-growing obsession. These feelings of familiarity, however, even as the dreams grew worse, I never gave up on my work, continued consulting floor plans, continued traversing Dust Wall Manor, and slowly my knowledge of my old ancestral family home expanded. First only in the most minute ways, but before long, bit by bit, the manor's complicated layout became clear to me. With it, more and more details of what my grandfather had told me returned to me. It felt as if I was leafing through a hidden tome, and with each day I was able to turn to a new page and read yet another paragraph. I remember my grandfather telling me that Sir Isaac's study wasn't merely a random location within Dust Wall Manor, but supposedly its very center, its foundation, and only reachable if you walked in the footsteps of the man himself and made their way to these very first rooms. As I slaved away, I realized that while many of the floor plans differed wildly, certain rooms, corridors, and wings were always there, always the same. By slowly combining them, stacking all their mad details on top of one another, I knew somehow a way through this mad labyrinth would reveal itself, and with it, a path that would lead me to Sir Isaac's study. It was trial and error, sheer insanity. I only took breaks to eat and rest. I drew endlessly, created my very own floor plans only to reject them again for an abundance of errors. And eventually, after how many weeks or months, I can't say, I succeeded in what I'd set out to do. What I stared at was a shoddy, hand-drawn creation of my very own, covered in notes and ramblings and filling almost the entirety of the floors of my meager quarters. But just as I'd thought, as I'd known, I'd found a singular path that snaked itself through the manor and reached what I could only assume to be its center. I set out almost immediately, driven half mad and wanting to prove that the study was just that, a room, a study. One that couldn't be more different from the ghastly dreams that so haunted me, and dispel these strange nocturnal illusions once and for all. I set out, flashlight in hand. I soon left the well-known hallways behind and instead followed constricted corridors, went up and down staircases, entered hidden rooms, and opened secret doors. It felt like I was traveling back in time as everything surrounding me grew older the further I progressed. At first, the path led me through rooms of contemporary and modern design, but I soon entered those of an older kind, neoclassical, Baroque furnishings, before finally ones that reminded me of the interior of Gothic castles, all while normal lamps and light bulbs were slowly replaced by oil lamps, candles, even old fireplaces covered in the dust of centuries. After what felt like days, or indeed centuries, traveled back in time, I finally made it to a room that appeared older than even the oldest parts of the manor itself. It was entirely unimpressive. Nothing but a small, crowded chamber, but its back wall comprised nothing but a heavy, giant, and heavily ornate hardwood door. It was covered in a variety of delicate carvings. Creatures of mythology held sway over one side, while the other was covered in biblical scenes. Yet between them I spied creatures much different, twisted, abominable beings hidden in the background, a mockery to the otherwise grand design, as if something older and darker was lurking behind the oh-so-common iconography. When I tried to open this door, I first thought it securely locked, before I realized just how heavy this age-old gate truly was. With all the force I could muster, grunting, panting, and cursing, I finally cracked it open and was instantly assaulted by stale, moist air thicker than any that I'd encountered before. It wafted from the doorway as thick as fog, and like pestilent vapors spread sluggishly over the room's floor. It was an air full of the smell of old age, the passage of centuries, but also pregnant with an indescribable, otherworldly vileness. I pushed myself past the door's heavy wood, ready to set foot into Sir Isaac's study and to finally lay eyes on the man's fabled portrait. What I found instead, however, were the first steps of an old spiral staircase that led down into the depths of the earth. For a moment I stared at these stairs and the looming darkness that lay beyond, but then, driven by an almost unnatural sense of curiosity, I began my descent. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video or for listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me over at Patreon. That's patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. I cannot thank you guys enough. You guys have been there when I'm struggling like I have over the past year, and it sincerely helps me stay alive. So thank you guys so much for being supporters. That goes for everybody who was down in the description, as well as AcidSystem, BallarmsTheRat, Blake Rattler, Mendoza, Brenna, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, Chainsmoker Dealer, ChicagoHitman, CoryxKenshin, Cronut508, CrusaderChocobo, CursepoxPrimarch, Dakota Best, Poulsen, Dante Kinkade, Kraus, Ellie Hutmire, Enchanted Buns, Estebean, Gemma, Halsey, HIDive's Nephew, Kimbo Jerry, Our Minute Seconds Time, Jay Keems, Jedis Pet, Jordan Humble, King Crab, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Old Penguin, Peaceful Buddha, Psychomel, Red Shadowcat, Remember the Sun, Rinku Star, Salty Surprise, Samara Line, Seclude, Simba's Bloody Mojo, Sky Harbor, Smiley the Psychotic, Sullyman, Tali Sue, the Chavez Brothers. Thank you so much. And honestly, thank you to everybody, even those guys that are in there for just $1, it really helps me out. Once again, that's patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. Or if you guys like to just listen, honestly, that helps me out a lot too. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and sweet dreams.